If you've been working with Next.js recently, or at least over the past year, you've probably already heard about these concepts of server and client components. Well, if you don't have a good understanding of that, we're going to be covering that in today's video, so let's go ahead and get into it. Next.js version 13 introduced a major shift in how we think about rendering in React. With the introduction of server and client components, it's more important than ever to understand how and when to use each one. But first, we're going to start by defining what these components are. What the heck are server components? Server components are rendered on the server. Simple as that. They send their HTML to the client side, and this means that they come with some really cool benefits. One, they're incredibly fast because they're rendered close to your database or your backend logic. Two, they reduce the JavaScript sent to the browser, which improves your performance. Three, they improve SEO. So the rendered HTML can be used by search engine bots to index your site and generate social card previews for your pages, which is something that was really big when spas like React and Angular first came out. Four, they're secure. So server components allow you to keep your sensitive data and logic on the server, such as your tokens and API keys, without the risk of exposing them to the client, which is another really big thing. By default, Next.js uses server components. So every component that you make in Next.js is a server component by default. So if we look in our code, our layout component is a server component. Heck, our homepage component is a server component. So always remember, when you're in Next.js, every component that you make by default is a server component unless you specify otherwise, which we'll talk about in the later segment when we talk about client components. So one of the things to note about server components is that server components do not have access to the browser functions. So some of the React hooks like use state, use effect, or some of the typical browser API interactions like on click, on change, these will not work in server components. So we can go ahead and try to make an example of this and just see what happens when we try to, introduce, for example, a React hook into a server component. So let's go ahead and look into our root page.tsx file, and let's try to add some state using the React state hook use state. So if we go ahead and just try to type this in, use state, and define a variable, right? We have a variable called count, and it's going to be of type number. And you can already see here, you have an error in your IDE. So it lets you know, like, hey, use state is not allowed in server components. And when we attempt to build this, it'll 9 times out of 10, it'll fail. So if we go ahead and try to run our app, right? Let's just see what happens. We would expect it to fail either during the build or when we try to access the page. So it does successfully build. But if we attempt to go to localhost 3000, let's see what error that we're greeted with. Let's just go to our root page and let's see what error pops up for us. And you can see here, it failed to compile. You get the error. You're importing a component that needs use state. This React hook only works in a client component. To fix this, mark the file or its parents with the use client directive, which is what we're going to be talking about next. So what are client components? Well, as opposed to server components, client components, you can probably guess, they run entirely on the browser. So these are perfect for interactive elements like forms, modals, or anything requiring user input. So if we come back to our root page that we've been working on, that we currently have our error in, the one thing that we can do to let Next.js know, like, hey, this is a client component. Since we're trying to use something that involves any type of browser functionality or interactivity, we need to mark this compliant as a client component. To do that, at the top of your file, you simply type in use client. This lets Next.js know, like, hey, this is a client component, not a server component, so we should not see an error anymore. And then just for giggles, let's go ahead and just log out count. And now if we go to our page, hello world renders. And then if we go into our browser, since we're console logging, you can see here, count is being rendered. So remember, whenever you're declaring a client component, you have to mark it at the top of the file because by default, Next.js makes every component a server component unless it's told otherwise. Now that we understand the gist of server and client components, the real fun starts when we can actually start interweaving server components and client components together. So for example, if you have a dashboard, you can have the base page be a server component, and then whatever requires like interactivity, like your form, you can make that a client component. I don't know if you guys remember in our last video with intercepting routes, you probably will notice in that code base we did something of the sort with our login form. But let's go ahead and hop into this with a quick code example. So coming back to our root page, let's go ahead and remove our client code from this. So we're gonna do what I said, basically just leave this as is as a default server component, and we're going to go ahead and create a new client component that we can then use inside of our server component. So let's go ahead and make a new directory, and then inside of here we'll just give it a base name of client component, and then didn't mean to do that. Client component.tsx, and then we just go ahead and define things. Export default function, client component. There we go. And then remember, since this is going to be a client component, let's go ahead and start by defining use client at the top, because by default this is a server component unless we specify otherwise. So now that we defined it, we can go ahead and declare a state variable. So we're just gonna go ahead and use count like we did before, and then just add a little bit of TypeScript stuff for flavor, basically saying that this is a type number, so we can't do any weirdness with it. And then let's just return a simple button. That literally does this. So increments on count, and then it'll display the count. So now that we've defined our client component, let's go ahead and import this into our page, which is a server component. So let's go ahead and do it like this. Let's put hello world into a span tag for now. It doesn't have to be pretty. We'll save the real deal code and stuff for later, and then we just import client component. If I can spell. So now when we go back to our page, we should expect to see a button with the count variable showing up. And look at that. And then if we click it, ooh, magic. 2, 3, 4. Voila, it's beautiful. So you're able to successfully import client components into your server component. All right, so now that we're starting to understand the power of server and client components, let's talk about some of the unsupported patterns or bad practices. So importing server components into client components. So this pattern is not supported, even though it technically is. It works, but it's just not efficient, because I actually tried to make this work and it did work with no error. But importing a server component into a client component is a no-no. It's a bad thing to do. Why is that? Well, when a new request is made to the server, all server components are rendered first, including those nested inside client components. So since client components are rendered after server components, you should not import a server component into a client component module, since it will require a new request back to the server, therefore making it inefficient. So instead, if you need to have a server component as a child of a client component in your layout or in your structure, you can pass it in as props. So how do we do that? Let's go ahead and do it with a quick example. All right, so here we are in our code. We have our client component that we made previously, and I also went ahead and made a quick server component. Server component. So this is a default server component, and we're going to try to import this into our client component by passing it as a prop. So to do that, we have to modify our client component. Let me take out our little test that I was doing earlier. And then we go in here and we update the prop. So let's go ahead and do it like this. So we'll just declare a new interface. We'll do props. Whoops. And then inside of it, we'll say children, react.react node. And then we'll say children of type props. So like this. And then it'll be as simple as throwing it like that, right? So we defined a new prop on our client component called children, and that means that we'll be able to pass our server component in through a prop like this. So if we go back to the page here, so you can already see us throwing an error saying this doesn't have children. So it's as simple as doing this. And then inside of here, we do server component. All right, so now that we've successfully declared our server component as a child of our client component, we should be able to go back to our browser, and you can see here that our server component was rendered successfully, as well as our client component still functions with our little button there. So That is how you pass in your server component as a prop to your client component if needed. Just like there is a function to designate files as client components, there is also a directive to designate your functions or files to be executed on the server, and that directive is called useServer. So let's quickly go over this directive in detail. So on the website documentation, we can see that the useServer directive designates a function or file to be executed on the server side. It can be used at the top of a file, just like how we did with useClient, or inline at the top of a function to mark a singular function as a server function. So let's look at a couple of examples. We don't need to really code with this since it works similar to what we just did with useClient, but let's just talk more about it. So using it at the top of a file, just like how we did useClient, you would just put useServer. And remember, you don't need to do this on your pages. This is only for function files. So in this example, they have a function file called actions.ts. So this is going to be all functions in this file will be able to be able to be executed on the server. So since we use it at the top of the file, everything under here, every function that we declare, it'll be able to be executed on the server. So moving on down the line, so using server functions in the client component, this is a big one. So to use server functions in your client components, you need to create your server functions in a dedicated file using the useServer directive at the top of the file. Then the server functions that you declare can be imported into the client and server components as needed and then executed. So for example, you can see here they did the same thing. They have an actions file, they labeled it with useServer, and we have a function called fetch users. And then on our client component, remember we declare it with useClient at the top of the file, and then we're able to import fetch users from that actions file. And you can also designate a function, a singular function, to be a server function by using the useServer directive in line as they've done right here. So after the function declaration, you'll just put it right above your logic, useServer. But the only caveat that comes with this is since your server logic can be imported by your client code, you want to make sure it's secure and it doesn't expose any private variables or keys that you may want to keep on the server side. So that's one of the biggest considerations when using this type of logic. Make sure that your private variables or your keys stay private so they are not exposed on the client. You don't want anybody hacking your stuff. Let's talk about keeping your server-only code out of your client environment. So since JavaScript modules can be shared between both server and client components, it's possible for code that you only want to run on your server to be run on your client, or it can make its way to your client components. To prevent this sort of unintended usage of your server-only code, we can use the server-only npm package to give other developers a build time error if you ever accidentally import one of your server-only modules into a client component. So let's go ahead and do this with a quick example. All right, so in our code base, let's go ahead and start by making a quick new directory, and we'll name it utils. And then inside of here, we'll make a file called getData.ts. And then we're just going to export default function getData, export default async. Make it, and we're not going to fetch any data. We're just going to like mock something out just so we can get an understanding. So if we do like return like a promise dot resolve ayo, let's go ahead and just make it do that. So it's just going to return a string called ayo. So now that we have our mock function, let's pretend like this getData function communicates with our database directly, since we only intend it to be a server function. So in our server component, it'll be as simple as, making a call to say constant data is equal to await get data. And then of course we'll have to make this async since we're doing a promise. And then let's import simple. And then we can also, if we want to play around with things, put data there, right? And then let's rerun our app just for a sanity check. So remember, this isn't a real function, but just pretend like this is a function that we're using to talk directly to our database to fetch some type of data. So if we go back here, you can see here our promise resolved ayo into our server component. But since we aren't using that package that we just talked about, we can also import it here. So if we go into our client component and we attempt to do the same thing, we were successfully able to import our server function into our client component, which is something we don't want to do. We want to have a way to prevent this, because if we end up importing a server only function into our client component, we risk exposing some variables, connection strings, to our database or our API that we don't want to expose on the client. So security risk. So to prevent this, so just for a sanity check, right, we call the get data function. So if we go back to localhost 3000, you can see here in our console, client component is able to have access to that. So remember, pretend like that get data function is a connection, or just a function that calls our database to get some data. We don't want the client component able to do this. So we need to install a package. This is where that server only package will come into play. So let's go ahead and do that. So if we go stop our app, and then we go into our terminal, and then if we type in npm I server only, so we successfully installed our server only package. And so with that, it is as simple as marking our get data function with import server only. So now when we attempt to rerun our app, we should get an error from our client component saying, hey, you're not supposed to use this. This is a server only function. So let's see what happens here. So we try to rerun our app. And then if we go to our localhost 3000, we get a build error. So there we go. You're importing a component that needs server only. That only works in a server component. So this is really helpful if you're working on a big team, or if you yourself are, forgetful. You're like, oh yeah, I made this component like months ago and I try to import it into a client component where it doesn't need to be. This will really save you from yourself, or, save you from your teammates if they don't know what the code looks like, or if they forget. This is really helpful in preventing what we just were able to do, importing a server function into a client component. One big tip that I want to share with you guys before we close out on this lesson is really take advantage of server components until you cannot. So what does this mean? Use server components until the case arises where you need some type of interaction or event handling logic in your code. And then when that case arises, break down that code into the smallest possible component. So instead of making your entire app a client component, you can do that, but instead of doing that, make the smallest thing possible in your tree. So the smallest component that requires that interactivity, make that a client component. That way you can still leverage the performance benefits of the server components of your other parts of your app, instead of converting everything into a client component. So that's just one of the big tips that I wanted to share that I've learned over the past year that I've been playing around with Next.js. Now that we have a good grasp on server and client components in Next.js, let's talk about some quick best practices and tips. So before we start going crazy with these things, remember, default to your server components. Use them whenever possible to leverage the performance benefits that we talked about at the beginning of the video. Be intentional with your client components. Only use them for interactions requiring, state management or event handling. Minimize the client-side JavaScript. Keep your client code lean and clean. And remember, if you are using client components, make sure you have that use client directive at the top of your file. And make use of that server only package to prevent unwanted usage of your server only functions in your client code. So by following these guidelines, you'll build apps that are clean, scalable, and user-friendly. So that's a wrap for today's deep dive on server and client components in Next.js 15. I just burped right there. Excuse me. Burped in my mouth a little bit. But I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you have any questions, drop them in the comments below. As always, if you found this helpful, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. We have a lot more things to cover this year. A lot more different topics, not even just Next.js, but we have a lot more coding topics to cover. So again, if I missed something, if you guys need me to explain something more, drop it in the comments. But until next time, I appreciate y'all for watching.